Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to cover the support changes which Phreak put out yesterday, and I'm going to talk about what I believe Phreak should do next in helping other classes within the games, and their current state and satisfaction. So let's get into it. To begin with, he wanted to adjust Alistar, so Alistar felt a bit more satisfying to play and and he wanted to loosen up the mana costs of his abilities. So which is why we're seeing mana reduction across the board. That combined with he wanted to make the AP ratios on the supports champions which he's chosen to buff feel a lot more satisfying and a lot less like not as bait. So you have options whether you can go like Dark Soul or Demonics, and yeah, it gives them more damage. This is like a 8 damage buff, I believe, fairly early on, and it doesn't really translate into a lot, but 8 damage is nice for the combo, and when he gets more opportunities to combo, it should overall feel nicer. This obviously is going to be a bigger buff towards the passive self-heal, and a bit of a nerf towards the ally heal. For Braum, he said Braum was in a fairly balanced state, which I agree. Braum in solo queue is always on the weaker side, but for the most part in pro, he can already function quite well into a lot of things. He wanted to make the passive line up with the 1-6-11 rather than 1-7-13, which isn't as satisfying for supports who tend to be limited in how high their levels go. 11 tends to be a bit of a later level rather than 13, which sometimes just isn't reachable. For base health and base health regen, both are going up slightly. This is to make Braum just have a bit more durability in laning phase. That combined with being able to counter some, being able to play into the chanters, not counter, play into them with a 2-second cooldown on Q. This isn't going to do a huge amount. This is it's going to help his poke, but you're going to throw the same amount of Qs usually, and yeah, it just allows some counter towards enchanters. Nautilus wanted to lead the charge for the balance changes in this patch, and being an engaged focus within pro play. He's pushing towards Nautilus being the lead. The passive is receiving 6 damage. This is fairly minimal, but it's quite nice. The W is having its mana cost lowered. This will help into poke, and you can use it as a defensive ability, but actually its ability to give him AoE on the autos is quite nice for pushing waves, and it's just generally nice when engaging onto someone. The shield is also going up by 10. This is also a fairly small buff, but it's quite nice. And E is having its damage buffed by 20 later on, and the AP ratio buffed. It'll be interesting to see if this impacts jungle Nautilus. I don't believe it will, but there is always a chance if something like a Dark Soul early pickup on Nautilus gives him some form of clearing of raptors with it's got a 350% AP 350% damage scaler for jungle monsters. It's actually really heavy on that, so it can do a lot of damage, but I don't know if this will push it like overboard or whether it was to be pretty bad. Pantheon is getting some attack speed at level 1. That combined with mana cost down on Q and Q also down in cooldown is going to help him quite a bit as support. He is definitely weak in the support role. I think this Pantheon support is generally pretty bad, but if they want to make it work, this is a good way of going about it. The scary thing here is the cooldown on Q was what kind of stops him from being played in the jungle as much. Lowering risk by 2 seconds, I reckon Pantheon jungle will come back, and it's already okay. The Q doing 105% damage to monsters makes it quite nice. This will definitely help it. That combined with just being able to spam more in laning phase, you can run mana flow, or this might mean that you don't have to run mana flow on Pantheon, making him pretty good in the top lane. Something like Mana Flow Scorch is what you used to run, or Transcendent Scorch. This can open up new options. Pantheon's already a really good mid laner. He counters a lot of the meta champions at the moment, so definitely consider playing Pantheon mid. But yeah, this is definitely going to help his support. Pyke is having a bit of a ratio buff on Q. This will help him scale more. That combined with some damage on E, this gives Pyke a lot more scaling. It won't do a huge amount towards his early. It will give him a slight bit more damage, definitely, but not a huge amount. E is the second max ability, so you'll only really start feeling the E and the Q buffs maybe 7 onwards. I don't imagine you'll feel it any earlier than that. Rakan is getting a huge amount of damage and heal added onto his Q. It gives him the ability to Q max. This most likely won't happen, but it gives him options into range champs possibly. But in that case, a lot of the time you are going to max W anyway because it does a lot of damage. You want the cooldown low on it so you can engage more often. But Q being a max option into something maybe like a Draven if you're really struggling to engage with W, because the W he can E you out of your W, making it really hard to land on him. So this overall will be quite nice. It's a pretty huge AP ratio buff, so I don't reckon we'll see Rakan mid, but maybe some hybrids in support can come through. Fresh is gaining 0.25 on the passive. This will help lower elo. Q is gaining 20 damage and the AP ratio is going up, so this will be a bit of a sizable damage increase later on. You're probably still going to max W maybe. There's a high chance you still do, but I reckon you'll probably max Q now. But as that's the goal of these changes, lowering the level 1s on both E and W, make it just lower the incentive of ranking these abilities up, and damage increase later on Q will increase the rank up incentive on this. AP ratios across the board on E and Q, quite nice with the passive, but shouldn't translate to too much. Fresh is a very exciting champ, and I think Fresh being in pro play is quite nice. He should definitely always have a bit of a presence. Radiant Virtue is being pushed away from the supports and more towards tanks. It's why the cooldown is going up, and the maximum health is also going up. But the ability haste and aura healing amp are being removed. You still get the healing aura of 50. Well, you still get a healing aura of 15% max health over 8 seconds, but so it'll heal a bit less if someone's at like 1% HP, but if someone's on a relatively high or like above half amount of HP, it's going to feel a bit better, definitely. So overall, these are the changes. I also wanted to talk about things you can do for tanks, because I reckon tanks are probably tanks and maybe assassins are the two classes which need adjusting the most, other than mages, which he does say he wants to work on, because mages currently don't feel particularly satisfying in solo queue, but then dominate in pro play. So hopefully that will have something will go on there. For tanks though, I think satisfaction is a big part of tanks. Jackson doesn't feel satisfying as an item to build. Heart still does, but it's bad. Radiant Virtue feels decent to build. I don't think it's too bad. And Iceborne also doesn't feel particularly satisfying. So if Iceborne and Jackson feel more satisfying, that would definitely be a big thing for tanks. Health of items, this is maybe making them more accessible for all tanks, rather than tanks being able to go 1 or 2 of them. Maybe they are only able to, at the moment, as of the moment, tanks only really have Radiant Virtue as a viable option. Jackson is on the weak side. Heartsteel is pretty bad. It's better in low elo, but it's still a pretty bad item. And Iceborne, as much as it's good, it's very limited by the fact that it has armor as a core component of its recipe. So you can't really build it into AP champs that easily. As of the moment, it's very much a case of you have to rush Sunfire or go Radiant. You don't really have any other choice. So hopefully they'll make that a bit more healthy. Pro presence, I wonder what kind of pro presence tanks should have in general. Because in top lane, you only really see Ornn. We've seen very few Ornns, maybe 1 or 2 across all major leagues. It's mostly bruisers and fighters we're seeing at the moment. So there should be a slight buff to pro presence. As of the jungle, Sejuani and I guess Maokai to some regards. Maokai's played more as an AP kind of bruiser rather than a tank. So it's kind of hard to define him as a tank. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what we can do, what he can do with pro presence and what kind of level we want to see. Because as viewers, we might find tanks to be pretty boring, and in that case, you don't want a particularly high presence. But I think having tanks is important in pro play, and tanks should appear more in pro play as they are more team kind of orientated champions. You are a frontline for an ADC, so you instantly become more team focused rather than an assassin who is very much feast or famine, very much playing for themselves. And it'll be interesting to see what we can like what is defined as a tank, because tanks are being given more and more damage every patch, and as much as it makes tanks feel better to play, we're getting closer to tanks being more like bruisers than tanks actually being this meat shield, like unstoppable kind of I will be the last man standing, rather because as of the moment there's so many armor pen, percentage health, true damage items in the game, champions in the game, stuff like this. It makes a tank feel squishy sometimes, which is why they are very tuned towards damage. Mundo, stuff like this always get damage. But it'll be interesting to see. I do want to see some tank adjustments. I think it's a pretty it's not in a healthy spot at the moment, because tanks aren't really tanks. So yeah, it'd be nice to see less damage, and I don't know how you do that and pull that off without losing satisfaction, but hopefully we can. So thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.